Okay, I'm in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. In the first part of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he talks about people joining together in marriage, and this was in response to questions that he was being asked about, well, what do we do with this or do with that? With regards to sexual immorality, he did encourage people to stay single if they were able to, if they could exercise self-control, that it would be in their interest. And as a solution to this, that they could make a change in their relationship with somebody else, such that they would join together in a marriage where that would be properly placed, that kind of activity. He goes on and he talks about some of the issues related to separating when people are married, whether or not they're going to get divorced. But he does encourage people to try to stay together. And so what he's doing is he's introducing kind of a theme at the beginning of chapter 7 of it's better to try to stay in whatever condition or state you are in. All right? It's better to try to stay where you are if you can, and make adjustments if it seems to resolve issues such as sexual immorality as an example. But for the most part, stay where you are, because it's from where you are that you are going to grow and mature in your faith. That just because you may make some significant changes in your physical life, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to make a change in your relationship with God. Your relationship with God is a relationship with God. Your relationship with other people is a relationship with other people. All right? And so try to maintain what you have. Don't make any drastic changes. And understand that if you're going to grow in your relationship with God, you're going to do that with Him. And that's not necessarily going to be affected by the relationships that you have with other people. Not necessarily. With regards to the subject of marriage, it's valuable to have someone else who is joined together with you in solving the problems of life. We are all faced with solving the problems of life, and these problems of life can be summarized into 4 different categories, or at least I have found 4 different categories that I think is a reasonably good way to summarize what it means to solve the problems of life. That you have to work, you have to eat, you have to do maintenance, and you have to rest. And being an individual, you will have to solve all of these problems in your life. When you are married, the expectation is that now you have 2 people working together to solve the problems of life. This, of course, does not always work out. In some cases, you end up having one person solving the significant problems of life for 2 people instead of one person, and that the other person just isn't doing their part in terms of what they can do in order to help solve the problems of life. But if you can have a relationship with somebody else, then certainly you can do more with 2 people than you can with one if they are working together and they are able to enjoy the benefits of what the other person does. Because when it comes to working, they may both be able to work on the same tasks. When it comes to eating, they can eat together, they can cook together, and they can clean up the mess together. And it turns out that there is some optimization in terms of the efficiency of solving the problems of life. When you're solving the problems for more than one person at a time, then there can be an opportunity for a greater sense of efficiency in working through these issues. But like I said, it's not always the case. This really depends on the relationship that a person finds themselves in. But in terms of the quality of their marriage, it can often be described in this way as to whether or not they would even want to stay in the marriage, because they may find themselves in a circumstance where they would feel much better being by themselves than they are feeling if they were with somebody else. And when that happens, then there can be opportunities for people to be thinking about whether or not they're going to depart from the relationship. All right, now it just so happens that I dropped my notes, and so I'm going to reach down here and grab them for just a moment. How's that for a video that I don't want to have to restart and start all over? No need to do that. I just reach down and grab them. All right, so where am I at in my notes? So when you are bound together with somebody else in a marriage, you're solving the problems of life with another person, and not necessarily just by yourself. But there are other factors involved in defining what a person's life is going to be. What are their values? What are the things that they do value? And it turns out that there can be a difference between those who are believers versus those who are unbelievers when it comes to what they value or what their values are. What about their goals in life? What's going to define their purpose in life? There are people who have goals and a sense of purpose that just doesn't fit very well with the life that God calls us to when we are called to a relationship with Him. If a person has decided that they want to live their life for the purpose of the indulgence of their flesh, in whatever way that might be, then when you have a spouse who is saved, who is married to somebody else who's just simply devoted to a life of indulging the flesh, and you got somebody who then gets saved, they may want to live differently. They will have things that are different, that are important to them. They will adopt different kinds of values. And it doesn't mean that they have to now live a life for the restraint of the flesh. That can be an issue, of course, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the case. That just because they were living a life for the indulgence of the flesh before, that now they're going to live for the restraint of the flesh. There is a different way of life in the new covenant of living by the inheritance in Christ, by what we have. And there is an opportunity for a person to experience a profound sense of peace and rest in the new covenant, as opposed to trying to live by the old or a form of it, or living for the indulgence of the flesh. And this can cause a disruption in the marital relationship because they're no longer pursuing the same objectives in life. They no longer value the same things in life. All right? And so when these changes take place, then the unbeliever may decide that they just don't want this person around them anymore for various reasons. They just don't want this person to be in their life. They don't want to have a relationship with this person because this person is kind of in the way now of them accomplishing those goals that they want to accomplish and live according to the purpose that they want to live for. That the other person just isn't going to cooperate so much because it just isn't something that they would like to do in consideration of the new life that they have entered into. So these kinds of disruptions can take place, and when they do, then the unbeliever may decide that they want to depart. Even the believer may decide that they want to depart from that marriage just because their values change and their interests change. And that of course is not encouraged, but it's just a fact of life that there are people who desire their lives to be different and they want to be disconnected from the relationship that they are in because they just find that it just isn't compatible with the direction that they're moving in. But Paul does encourage people to do what they can to stay in the condition that they are in, to stay with the relationships they have, because growing in your relationship with God is a separate relationship. All right, so that's kind of the theme that he introduces at the beginning of chapter 7, and then there are some other examples of this theme that I'll explain in just a moment. He gives the example of circumcision. He gives the example of slavery, still kind of sticking with the same theme of try to stay in the same condition that you are in. All right, moving to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 16, with regards to marriage and the fact that there can be a divorce. Let me review a little bit from verse 14. Let me go back up to verse 13. Where does this really start? Verse 10, right? Okay. Verse 10, now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, a wife is not to depart from her husband. But even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. And I was explaining this in the previous message. But to the rest, I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. And I talked about this in terms of the definition of sanctification and holiness, and where does that really come from? In the previous message, verse 15. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. But God has called us to peace. To live in peace is much more important than living in a marriage in which there is no peace or a significant lack thereof. Okay, moving on into verse 16. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? Okay, in response to just let the marriage end. Because how do you know? I mean, how do you know anything's going to be different? How do you know anything may change? That's the idea that's presented through salvation by saying that, you may contribute to the salvation of your husband or to your wife, or you might not. And if they do get saved, well, then maybe they will move in the direction of being more compatible with you, just as the two of you were compatible just fine earlier in the world. But now that one of you has entered into the kingdom of heaven through a relationship with God, in that sense, you have departed from the relationship that you initially agreed to in a certain way. You have departed from the marital relationship in the sense of those things that are important, the purpose, the values. A believer departs from that previous relationship. So how do you know if the other spouse will or will not depart from that previous condition that they were in to enter into something closer to you? How do you know? You don't know. And if they did, that doesn't necessarily mean that the problems of life are going to improve. The solutions to the problems of life are going to improve, or the things are still going to get along. So even if they do get saved, how do you know if that's even really going to work either? They might become quite religious in the sense of, well, they're going to be completely devoted to living their lives to the restraint of the flesh. And now you got religious pride, you got criticism, condemnation, all kinds of new problems are going to develop in the personal relationship if you've got one person who's living by the new covenant and the other person who's living by the old. All right? I mean, there's some new dynamics that can cause some real dysfunction in terms of the relationship there. But he brings up a good point here in verse 16 of, how do you know if you're going to contribute to the salvation of somebody else or not? Okay, I think a really good way to really consider this is consider God. God is really impressive as a person, isn't he? He's really impressive. But regardless of just how impressive he really is as a person, do people get saved because they think, oh, wow, God is so impressive? That's not usually what people are thinking. I mean, that's kind of unusual as to somebody saying, oh, boy, I really want to become a child of God because look at how awesome God is. He's so awesome. I like to be like him. But this is what a lot of people try to encourage in Christianity, where they will say things like, now, if you will become, a really awesome person now that you're a Christian. If you get all the sin out of your life and you're doing all these good things for God, then people are going to see that, and boy, they're just going to be so impressed that they're going to want to be saved also. And I got to ask, do you know of anybody who has been saved because they saw somebody else and thought, oh, wow, that person is just so impressive. Boy, I'd like to get to know God too. I will acknowledge that has probably occurred. I'm just saying that I personally don't know of anybody who's made a decision like that in that way. I kind of got close to it in the sense that I realized that I was not the kind of person that I would even want to know. I was the kind of person that I did not even want to know. And that I definitely need to be different. I've got to become a different person than who I once was. But I didn't look at other people and say, well, I guess I'll become one of those, I did in a sense that I thought, well, I can become a rabbi, and if I do that, then I'll become a good person, and I'll have a place in society and in civilization, and people will like me. But I didn't really look at any specific rabbi and say, oh boy, that's a really good rabbi. I want to be just like him. That wasn't what I was thinking even back then. So while this is promoted a lot, where people will say, if you'll just be a really good Christian, then people are going to get saved. I don't think that really happens. And I'll use the example of God himself. Not even God himself is able to save people because he couldn't be any more impressive than he is, right? Here's the perfect representation of somebody like that. When he came and lived as Jesus, people don't look at Jesus and say, oh, wow, Jesus is just so awesome. I want to be a Christian. People just don't think in those terms. There usually is some self-interest involved as opposed to being impressed by somebody else's performance in some way. All right, and so this abstraction of how do you know if you're going to save your husband or save your wife, well, chances are you're not. And you wouldn't want to stay in the marriage because maybe you will or maybe you won't. That's not a legitimate reason. Because in general, I would suggest you're not. Okay, so don't let that be an excuse to say, well, I got to stay married because I might save my husband. I got to stay married because I might save my wife. And I think that Paul says here in verse 16 that that's not a legitimate reason. Okay, it just isn't. If that person is going to get saved and have a relationship with God, it's because they want to have a relationship with God. All right, they already have a relationship with you. It's not about changing a relationship with you necessarily. It's going to have to be because they want a relationship with God, not because you have one, but because they want to have one. That's a personal decision that everyone has to make on their own with themselves, between themselves and the Lord. It's not something that's done in a collective sense. All right, not the real kind of relationship that God has called us to. You can invent a fictitious one, and maybe that will move somebody in the direction of having a personal one, but it may not necessarily work out so well. All right, and so regardless of whether a person is saved or not, you don't know what's going to go on. And so if they want to leave, then don't complain or protest. Let them leave. What are you going to say? You're going to say, no, I think you should stay. Please stay because I'm going to be so nice to you. I'm going to be such a good person that you're going to want to get saved also. Go ahead and try that and see how that's going to work out. It's not likely going to improve the situation. I would not expect it to. That if it does, then praise the Lord. I won't. I won't protest that. I'm just letting you know that seems to be the tone of what he's describing here. Again in verse 16, for how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? Now, of course, you won't save them. You can contribute to their decision to be saved, but only the Lord will save them or will not. Okay, going to verse 17. But as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. And so I ordain in all the churches, as you have been called, in the condition that you are in. Walk from where you are. Live your life in Christ Jesus from where you are. You don't need to make significant changes in your life. Your life is where you are. You will grow and mature and get to know the Lord from wherever you are at. I have grown to know my God through the circumstances of my life. All right, as I have encountered tremendous tribulations and struggles and sufferings, he has walked through those things with me. And in doing so, he has shared a lot with me that I don't think he would have ever been able to show me otherwise. Just as an example, there have been many good things that I've experienced in my life, and through that, the Lord has showed me a lot about himself through those good things. But I live my life from where I was, from the condition that I was in. And as my condition changed, I made use of it the best I could. But that was not my objective to say, okay, well, if I'll change my life, then my relationship with God will improve. No, my relationship with God will improve in the condition of whatever my life is in. All right, that's the theme that he presents here in chapter 7. So I think that verse 17 is a good back reference to verse 7. If you take a look at verse 7, he says, "For I wish that all men were even as myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that." All right, I wish that everybody was like me, but everybody's got their own gift, their own ways of interacting with this world, and their own condition in what they are in, and whatever condition that may be in the world. So live from where you are, because it won't really matter if your life changes significantly. It may not matter in a significant way. You may have a life that you enjoy much more personally, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your relationship with the Lord is going to change because of that. If you think that it will, then I think you're missing out on opportunities through which you can grow to know him more. All right, so that's in verse 17. From verse 18, we have a continued example of staying in the condition that you're in. In verse 18, was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Okay, now this is an introduction to how are we really going to live our lives? Are we going to live by the law, for example? And circumcision was a commandment of God to say that, if you're a man, this is applicable. This is something that you are to do. And Paul said, no, the life that we have is not to now go live for the restraint of the flesh through obedience to the commandments of God. All right, don't enter into some religious way of life. Another way to think about it is don't become like a Jew. I had a friend recently contact me and said that she was thinking about converting to Judaism. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I haven't heard that for a while. That people have decided that they want to pursue that. And if you want to do that, then of course I would encourage you to do that. But to understand that I don't think that's the way that God wants us to live. And I gave some examples, and I said, look, a lot of people's lives have been changed. You can go to the Living God Ministries website and look at the recent testimonials page and see how people's lives have been changed and how they have grown to know the Lord. But this did not happen because I encouraged them to convert to Judaism. All right, that's not how that happened. And so if you're going to do that, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a testimony that's going to be added to this page. It doesn't mean that that's how it's going to go. In fact, I would suggest that it would not, because now you're going to pursue a life of living in obedience to the commandments of God, which has to do with the restraint of the flesh. And that was established by God in order to prepare people to receive what Jesus had to say about this life is impossible. It is impossible to live this way and be right with God. It's not going to happen. You're never going to be blessed. You're always going to be cursed. So that the people would then recognize that the life of living by the knowledge of good and evil isn't going to work. This solves the problem that was introduced with the fall of humanity back in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve decided to reject God in favor of the knowledge of good and evil. That would be the same thing. If you decide, I'm uncircumcised, I'm going to be circumcised. I'm going to live by the commandments of God. I'm going to become a good Jew, whatever, however you may decide to pursue that. What you end up doing is saying, I am now going to live a life under the knowledge of good and evil, which was what Adam and Eve believed when they rejected God. It's another form of rejecting God. That's what it becomes. It becomes another form of rejecting Him, where He was using the law for the purpose of showing that this is not the way of life, to solve the problem that was introduced through Adam and Eve when they fell, when humanity fell. This was what it was over. So let's solve the problem. Let's answer the question, is this really how we are to live, or is it not? That's what He was doing. And at the appointed time, God manifested in the flesh and showed up personally and explained to the people that it wasn't working to His satisfaction. That while they may be impressed with each other, He certainly wasn't impressed with their religion, with their obedience, with their observance of the commandments, being circumcised, that sort of thing. It wasn't doing anything to create or sustain a relationship with God at all. So, through answering these questions and solving this problem, He was then able to introduce a different covenant, a new covenant that has nothing to do with whether a person is circumcised or not circumcised. Has nothing to do with that at all. So if you're circumcised, fine, so be it. If you're uncircumcised, fine, so be it. Because the new covenant has nothing to do with that. All right, the relationship that God has called us to has nothing to do with that. So stay in the condition that you are in, because you're going to grow and mature in completely different, unrelated ways anyway. Why try to make changes there, thinking that there's going to be some kind of positive change or positive effect from that when there just isn't? Okay, so again, from verse 18, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 18, was anyone called while circumcised? And this has to do with responding to the call of God. God calls out to the world saying, this is what I've got to offer. Does anybody want it? And only a few people will be willing to respond to what God is offering, and they will decide to receive the free gift of eternal life. Those are the ones who He is calling out to, the ones who will receive what He is offering. And only a certain kind of person is willing to do that. And that kind of a person is the kind of person who has decided themselves what they are going to value and what they won't value. All right, so was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Don't make a decision to change that. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Verse 19, circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. All right, now he says more in verse 19, but let's pause here for just a moment. Circumcision is nothing. Uncircumcision is nothing. Well, now circumcision is part of the commandments of God. God commanded that there should be circumcision. Keep reading in verse 19, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. How does that matter? When he says circumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. Circumcision is a commandment of God. Wouldn't it matter? Okay, no, it only matters if you're going to observe all of the commandments. Not just that one, but all of them. Okay? And this is an issue because a lot of people will just pick and choose a few of them and say, well, I'll get circumcised and I won't eat bacon double cheeseburgers anymore. And they think that, okay, now I'm a good Jew. Now I'm holy. Now I'm sanctified. Now, and I'll study the Ten Commandments more, and I'll observe the festivals and make sure I don't labor on the Sabbath day. And through all of that, now that's what matters. No, everything else needs to matter also. If you will not observe all of the commandments, then you will not be like God. Okay? And try to remember what Jesus said when he presented the Sermon on the Mount. He said, you are to be as perfect as God, or you will in no way enter the kingdom of heaven. Now you try that. All right, be as perfect as God. And I'll check in with you every once in a while. So how you doing? Are you as perfect as God yet? You think that's going to happen sometime soon? That's what matters. If you want something to matter, that's what will matter. And so what really does matter there? The discovery, keeping the commandments of God, is the way of discovering that it is not the way. And that's what matters. All right? You got to keep everything in mind. Remember, it's not just what is said here in this one verse. It's all that the Lord has had to say that makes it clear what Paul is communicating here. Circumcision is nothing. Uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping the commandments of God is what matters. So if you're going to do it all. That's what matters. And if you don't do it all, then, well, that just shows that you will in no way enter the kingdom of heaven. And it's good for you to come to that conclusion so you can realize that if you are, it's going to have to be through some other way besides circumcision or keeping the commandments. It's going to have to happen through some other way. And the only other way is through the grace and mercy of God as he presented it through the new covenant, a different covenant, through which a person can be changed, transformed, and have a place in the kingdom of heaven. Same theme from there in verse 19. Verse 20, let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. All right, remain in the same state that you are in when you responded to the call of God, is effectively what that means. Let everyone remain in the same, if you're single, stay single, unless, you just really, really want to have a spouse. You really want to be married, then fine. Do that. Stay married. If you're married, stay married. Stay in the condition you're in. Don't be making changes like that. Okay? If you're circumcised, stay circumcised. Don't try to make adjustments to that if you could. If you're uncircumcised, don't make changes to that either. Again, verse 20, let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. All right, because again, the growth that we experience in our relationship with God takes place in the condition that we're in, regardless of the condition that we are in. The objective is to know the Lord, not change these conditions. All right, and knowing the Lord is not going to necessarily be affected by changing these kinds of conditions. And so keep the objective in mind. Keep the purpose in mind. The objective of knowing your God more and growing in your personal relationship with him, to participate in the things that he is doing, and for him to be a participant in your life with the things that you are doing. He introduces another example, slavery, which I'll just briefly mention and then I'm going to end this message. in verse 21, were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it, but if you can be made free, rather use it. There you go. Another example of stay in the condition that you're in and grow in your relationship with the Lord regardless of where you are at and what kind of condition you are in. Even if you're a slave or if you're free, those things just don't matter. Those are the issues of the flesh. Those have to do with us solving the problems of life. All right? But it's through solving the problems of life that God is able to show us so much about who He is as a person, regardless of what problems we are working through. All right, I'm going to pause here. For those of you who are using this for small groups, I have a question that can facilitate some conversation. What are some of your goals for your life? All right, what are some of your goals? And this, of course, implies change. Well, what would some of those things be? Which can be good things, right? And to be encouraged. But what are some of those goals that you have? Connected to this is the idea of if you are single or if you are married, in what way is this going to affect the relationship you have with your spouse? Maybe you have goals that you're not able to accomplish, or purposes that you'd like to have. You're not able to accomplish because of your relationships with other people. Or do you even have them at all? Maybe you don't. Maybe you're just waiting until you're dead. Okay, and if that's the case, perhaps this could be a good time to think about, well, what kinds of goals might you like to embrace? What kinds of purposes might you want to have in your life? Not to make some kind of drastic change right away, and not to just let life happen to you, but to understand you are an engaged participant in this life, and that you do make decisions about what your life is going to be. So what might some of those goals or interests or purposes be that you have in your life experience? And I'll continue into the topic of slavery in the next message. Thanks.